You watched this war end on live television, and most people still don't understand what they actually saw. August 2021. A government collapses in days. An army trained and equipped for 20 years simply stops fighting. And a group declared defeated 2 decades earlier walks back into the capital without firing a shot. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly how that happened. Not through some sudden military breakthrough. Through 20 years of patience, while the other side ran out of exactly that. This wasn't a war decided by a single battle or a single mistake. It was decided by a question almost nobody asked clearly enough 20 years earlier, when the fighting first began. Which side actually needed a fast victory, and which side could simply afford to wait? To understand how this war ended, you have to go back further than most people realize. Back before the Taliban even existed. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, propping up a communist government facing rebellion from religious and tribal fighters across the countryside. The United States, along with Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, poured billions of dollars into arming those fighters, known as the Mujahideen, hoping to bleed the Soviets in a drawn-out guerrilla war. The program funneling weapons and money to the Mujahideen ran largely through Pakistan's intelligence service, which decided which commanders received support and how much. Entire training camps sprang up along the Afghan-Pakistan border, producing a generation of fighters skilled in exactly the kind of rugged, mountainous guerrilla warfare that would matter enormously decades later. It worked. In 1989, after nearly a decade of fighting, Soviet forces withdrew. But withdrawal didn't bring peace. The Soviet-backed government in Kabul held on for a few more years, then collapsed in 1992. And the Mujahideen factions that had united against a common enemy immediately turned on each other. What followed was one of the most brutal civil wars of the era. Rival warlords carved up the country. Kabul itself was reduced to rubble in fighting between former allies. Checkpoints run by armed militias controlled every road, extracting money, and sometimes far worse, from anyone who needed to pass. Entire neighborhoods of the capital that had survived a decade of Soviet occupation relatively intact, were leveled in just a few years of infighting between Mujahideen commanders who had once fought side by side. Estimates of civilian deaths during this period run into the tens of thousands, in a country already exhausted from more than a decade of continuous war. For ordinary Afghans, the promise of the anti-Soviet resistance had curdled into daily, unpredictable violence. It's out of this chaos that the Taliban emerges. The word Taliban simply means students. Many of the earliest members had studied in religious schools, largely across the border in Pakistan, during the refugee crisis created by years of war. Their leader, a low-profile cleric named Mullah Omar, had lost an eye fighting the Soviets, and reportedly formed the group's earliest corps in 1994 near the southern city of Kandahar. According to widely reported accounts, the group's earliest actions weren't grand ideological campaigns. They were smaller, local interventions, a checkpoint commander abusing travelers, dealt with, a dispute settled swiftly and without the usual bribes. Word spread through southern Afghanistan quickly. Here, finally, was a group offering something the exhausted population hadn't seen in years: predictability. Mullah Omar himself remained a deliberately obscure figure throughout his leadership, reportedly meeting with almost no foreign officials and rarely being photographed. A level of secrecy that would later make him remarkably difficult for intelligence agencies to track once the war against his movement began. Even the exact circumstances and timing of his death, which reportedly occurred years before it was publicly acknowledged by his own organization, remained hidden from the outside world for an unusually long time. Their pitch was strikingly simple, especially to a population exhausted by warlord violence. Order. An end to checkpoints run by armed criminals. Strict, uncompromising religious law enforced without negotiation. For many Afghans in 1994, order at any cost sounded better than the alternative they'd been living through. The Taliban's advance was fast. Kandahar fell almost immediately. City after city followed with minimal resistance, as exhausted local populations and defecting militia commanders opened the way. By September 1996, the Taliban took Kabul itself, and within a few years, controlled roughly 90% of the country. One detail from the fall of Kabul reveals exactly how personal and how brutal this new order intended to be. Mohammad Najibullah, the former Soviet-backed president who had been sheltering in a United Nations compound in the city for years, was seized by Taliban fighters the day the capital fell. He was killed, and his body was publicly displayed, a message to anyone who might have doubted how completely the old order had ended. Their rule imposed rules that shocked much of the outside world. Women were barred from most jobs and from schools past a certain age. Television, music, and most forms of public entertainment were banned outright. Punishments for violations of religious law were carried out publicly, often in stadiums that had once hosted sporting events. International recognition remained limited throughout this period. Only 3 countries, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, formally recognized the Taliban's government as legitimate. To most of the world, Afghanistan under Taliban rule existed in a kind of diplomatic isolation, cut off from the international financial system and largely absent from global institutions. And critically, the Taliban's government provided safe harbor to a foreign militant, Osama bin Laden, and the terrorist network he led. That decision, more than almost anything else, set the stage for everything that came next. On September 11, 2001, al-Qaeda operatives hijacked 4 commercial airliners, killing nearly 3,000 people on American soil. Within weeks, the United States demanded the Taliban hand over bin Laden. When they refused, a U.S.-led coalition launched airstrikes and ground operations across Afghanistan. The demand was, by most historical accounts, delivered with little room for negotiation, and the Taliban's leadership, despite mounting international pressure and the near-total collapse of what little diplomatic standing they had, refused to comply. Whether that decision reflected genuine ideological loyalty to bin Laden, tribal codes of hospitality toward a guest, or simple miscalculation about the scale of the response coming their way, remains debated among historians of the period. What's certain is the consequence. Within a month of the September 11th attacks, American bombs were falling across Afghanistan. The Taliban government collapsed astonishingly fast. Major cities fell within weeks. By December 2001, Taliban leadership had scattered, largely across the border into Pakistan's tribal regions, and a new, US-backed government began forming in Kabul. American and Allied casualties during this initial invasion were remarkably light compared to the scale of the operation, largely because much of the ground fighting was carried out by Afghan opposition forces, coordinated with American air power and small numbers of special operations troops. For a brief moment, it appeared the entire conflict might be resolved in a matter of months. For a moment it looked like the story was over. It wasn't. Here's the detail most people miss about this entire conflict. The Taliban never actually surrendered in 2001. They dispersed. Many fighters simply melted back into rural villages, put down their weapons temporarily, and waited. Within a few years, an insurgency began rebuilding. Funded partly by the opium trade, sheltered partly across the porous Pakistan border, and fueled by growing frustration with a new Afghan government widely seen, especially in rural areas, as corrupt, distant, and dependent on foreign soldiers to survive. Afghanistan's opium production, largely concentrated in provinces where Taliban influence remained strongest, became one of the group's most significant funding sources during these years. Reports from international monitoring agencies throughout the 2000s and 2010s repeatedly identified the country as the source of the overwhelming majority of the world's illicit opium supply, generating revenue that helped sustain the insurgency even as it lost formal control of the country's cities. Eradication programs, funded largely by the United States, spent years and enormous sums attempting to destroy poppy fields across the south of the country. The results were mixed at best. Farmers in regions with few other reliable sources of income often simply replanted, sometimes with quiet Taliban protection in exchange for a share of the proceeds, turning a moral and legal issue into an economic one that proved far harder to eliminate than outside planners had anticipated. The United States and its NATO allies spent the next 2 decades trying to build a functioning Afghan state from the ground up. Hundreds of billions of dollars flowed into training an Afghan army, building infrastructure, and supporting a government in Kabul. Much of that spending, according to numerous government audits conducted over the years, never reached its intended purpose. Contracts were awarded to companies with connections to powerful local figures rather than to those most capable of delivering results. Equipment purchased for the Afghan military sometimes sat unused, poorly maintained, or was resold on the black market. A steady stream of official reports throughout the war years documented waste, fraud, and corruption on a scale that undermined the very legitimacy the funding was meant to build. For ordinary Afghans, watching billions flow into projects they never saw the benefit of, while their own daily lives remained defined by insecurity and limited opportunity. The gap between the promises made in Kabul and Washington and the reality on the ground grew wider with each passing year. But outside the major cities, in the villages where most Afghans actually lived, the picture looked very different. In many rural districts, local Taliban commanders quietly rebuilt something close to a shadow government. Their own courts, settling land and family disputes according to religious law, often faster and, in the eyes of many villagers, more fairly than the official, foreign-backed courts riddled with bribery. Their own tax collection, their own local authority, running in parallel to a Kabul government that, for many rural Afghans, barely felt present at all. Researchers studying the conflict during this period repeatedly documented the same pattern across different provinces. Where the official government's presence amounted to little more than an occasional convoy passing through, and a distant promise of eventual development that rarely arrived, the shadow structures filled the gap, consistently, year after year, regardless of who held power in Kabul or Washington. This is the part of the war that never made most television broadcasts back home. It wasn't primarily fought in dramatic battles. It was fought village by village, for legitimacy, patience, and control over daily life, in places where international attention rarely reached. A commander attributed to the Taliban, discussing the war with a Western journalist years into the conflict, reportedly summarized their entire strategy in one line: "The Americans have the watches. We have the time." It wasn't an idle boast. Public support for the war in the United States and allied countries steadily eroded over 2 decades, through changing administrations, rising costs, and a war that many voters increasingly saw as unwinnable. Meanwhile, the Taliban simply needed to survive long enough for that political patience to run out. The financial cost alone reshaped the political conversation around the war, year after year. Estimates of the total American expenditure on the conflict, factoring in military operations, reconstruction efforts, and long-term veteran care, run into the trillions of dollars over the full 2 decades. A public opinion polling throughout the later years of the war consistently showed a majority of Americans no longer believed the conflict was worth continuing, regardless of which political party controlled the White House at the time. 4 different American presidents, from both political parties, inherited this war, and each, in turn, promised some version of an eventual end to it. The promise was easier made than kept. Troop levels rose and fell. Strategies shifted from counterterrorism to nation building and back again. Through all of it, the underlying dynamic never changed. One side was fighting on a political clock. The other wasn't. By the late 2010s it had. In 2020, the United States began direct negotiations with the Taliban in Doha, Qatar, largely without the Afghan government's full participation, a fact that severely damaged the legitimacy of the Kabul administration in the eyes of many Afghans, watching their own fate be decided elsewhere. The resulting agreement set a timeline for a complete withdrawal of American forces. For the Taliban's negotiators, the agreement represented the culmination of nearly 2 decades of strategy. They had outlasted an occupying coalition without ever needing to win a conventional battlefield victory. For the Afghan government in Kabul, watching its most powerful ally negotiate its country's future directly with the group it had spent 20 years fighting sent an unmistakable signal about how much longer that support was likely to last. The agreement itself included commitments from the Taliban regarding counter-terrorism guarantees and a reduction in violence. Promises that outside monitors found difficult to verify, and that many analysts viewed skeptically from the outset. Regardless of how fully those specific terms were honored, the core outcome of the negotiations was never in doubt. American forces were leaving on a fixed timeline, and every armed actor inside Afghanistan understood exactly what that meant for the balance of power once they were gone. Through 2021, as the withdrawal accelerated, something remarkable, and to many observers, deeply alarming, began happening across the country. Provincial capitals started falling to Taliban forces, not through prolonged sieges, but often through negotiated surrenders. Afghan army units, unpaid, poorly supplied, and increasingly convinced their own government had already given up, simply stopped fighting. In province after province, the pattern repeated with striking consistency. Local Taliban commanders, many of whom had spent years quietly building relationships and shadow authority in these exact districts, offered government forces a straightforward choice. Surrender your weapons and your post peacefully, and you're free to go home. Resist, and face a fight many soldiers no longer believed their own government was prepared to support. Faced with that choice, and months of unpaid wages, entire garrisons chose to walk away rather than fight. City after city fell within days of each other. By early August, more than half the country's provincial capitals had changed hands. On August 15, 2021, Taliban fighters entered Kabul. President Ashraf Ghani fled the country. There was no final battle for the capital. The government that 20 years and immense resources had been spent building simply ceased to exist within hours. Foreign embassies scrambled to evacuate staff. Helicopters lifted diplomatic personnel from rooftops in scenes that drew immediate, uncomfortable comparisons to the fall of Saigon nearly half a century earlier. Within the city itself, confusion reigned, as residents who had lived their entire adult lives under the post-2001 government tried to understand what daily life under Taliban rule might now mean for them personally. Scenes from Kabul's airport in the days that followed, desperate crowds trying to board departing military flights, some clinging to the outside of aircraft as they took off, became some of the defining images of the entire war's conclusion. The evacuation effort that followed became one of the largest airlifts in modern history, moving well over 100,000 people out of the country in a matter of weeks. It was also marked by chaos and tragedy, including a suicide bombing at one of the airport's gates that killed over 100 people, among them 13 American service members, in the war's final and one of its deadliest single incidents. So how does an insurgency, fighting the most well-funded military coalition in modern history, actually win? Not through superior weapons or technology. On paper, the mismatch in firepower was never close. The coalition arrayed against the Taliban possessed air power, satellite surveillance, and precision weaponry that dwarfed anything the insurgency could field. In a conventional, symmetrical war, there was no contest at all. But this was never a conventional war, and both sides eventually understood that better than outside observers often did. The Taliban rarely tried to hold territory against a direct, sustained assault. They absorbed losses, faded into the countryside, and returned once the pressure eased, over and over, for 2 decades. Each individual engagement they lost mattered far less than the cumulative pattern it built. A war that never definitively ended is, from an insurgent's perspective, a war that never needed to be conventionally won. They won through patience that outlasted their opponent's political will. Through a shadow government that filled a legitimacy vacuum the official state never fully closed. Through safe havens across an international border that were never fully eliminated. And through a withdrawal negotiated on a timeline that left the Afghan military and government exposed before they were ready to stand fully on their own. The war ended the way it did because one side needed to win, permanently, in every province, in a fixed number of years, under constant domestic political pressure back home. The other side simply needed to not lose, indefinitely. For as long as it took. Since retaking power, the Taliban has governed under the name Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, with its supreme leader holding near absolute authority over the country's political, administrative, and religious institutions. As of this recording, most of the world still hasn't formally recognized the government as legitimate. Only one country, Russia had extended full diplomatic recognition as of mid-2025. The economic consequences of the takeover and the international isolation that followed have been severe. Billions of dollars in Afghan central bank assets held overseas were frozen almost immediately after the collapse, cutting off the new government from a significant portion of the country's foreign reserves. Humanitarian organizations have repeatedly warned of worsening poverty and food insecurity across the country in the years since, even as the fighting itself largely ended. International scrutiny over the treatment of women and girls under the new government has remained intense, with restrictions on education and public life drawing continued condemnation from human rights organizations and foreign governments alike. Girls have been barred from secondary education in most of the country since shortly after the takeover, a policy that has become one of the central obstacles to any broader international recognition of the government. The International Criminal Court has also become involved, issuing arrest warrants in 2025 for senior Taliban officials over allegations connected to the persecution of women and girls, a step that further complicates any path toward the kind of international acceptance the group has occasionally signaled it wants. That's not a story specific to Afghanistan. Historians and military analysts studying insurgencies across different eras and regions have identified the same basic pattern, again and again, in conflicts stretching from Vietnam decades earlier to other, smaller wars fought since. A foreign power, however dominant militarily, operates on a political clock, shaped by elections, public opinion, and the rising cost, in lives and money, of an open-ended commitment. A local movement, fighting for what it considers its own territory, often doesn't face that same clock at all. The war that was supposed to end with a stable, self-sufficient Afghan democracy instead ended with the same movement that had been driven from power 20 years earlier walking back into the same palace, having simply waited out an opponent that couldn't wait as long as they could. If you want to understand exactly what happened during those final chaotic days at Kabul's airport, the evacuation effort, the bombing at the gate, and the decisions made in the last hours before the final flights departed, that story is next. Every war eventually gets reduced to a single image in most people's memory. For this one, it's likely to be a transport plane on a runway, and a crowd running alongside it, refusing to be left behind. But the story of how the country actually got to that runway took 20 years, 4 American presidents, and a strategy patient enough to outlast every single one of them.